The stagecoach arrived on a Tuesday morning, which was the same as any other morning in Duskwater, except for the fact that half the town had come out to watch it stop. Men stood along the boardwalk with their hands in their pockets, pretending they had other reasons to be there. Women clustered near the dry goods store, speaking behind their hands in the particular way that women speak when they want to be heard, but not blamed for speaking. Boys had climbed onto barrels and fence posts for a better view. Even old Burl had come out from behind his counter, which people in town said happened only twice a year and usually involved something catching fire. The stagecoach driver set the brake, and the dust that had followed the coach all the way from Hatcher's Crossing caught up at last and settled over everything in a fine pale layer. Nobody moved. Then the door opened. She stepped down without waiting for assistance. One hand gripped the door frame. The other held, with a firmness that had nothing casual about it, a leather tube the length of her forearm, worn smooth at the ends and darkened at the seams from years of handling. She carried one other bag, a traveling case of brown leather so old that the stitching along the top had been re-sewn at least twice, in 2 different colors of thread. Her dress was gray. Her boots were the color of dust, which was also the color of everything else in Duskwater that time of year. Her hat had once had a shape to it, but the shape had long since given up the fight. She wore her hair pinned back simply, no curls, no decoration. She was 34 years old, and she looked like a woman who had carried things for a long time and had gotten very good at it. She stood in the street and looked at the town. The town looked back. Then someone laughed. Not a kind laugh. The sort that starts in the back of the throat and means something other than humor. Greyson Mull stood at the edge of the boardwalk, 10 feet from the coach, and he did not laugh. He was 40 years old, lean and weathered in the way that men get when they work outside in all seasons without thinking much about it. His hair was dark with gray beginning at the temples. His face was the kind that did not show much of what was happening behind it. He had come to town that morning in a clean shirt, which was as close to ceremony as he knew how to get. He had been watching the door of that coach for 20 minutes. He watched her now, the way she stood, the way she did not flinch at the laughter, the way her eyes moved across the crowd with a quality that was not fear and was not anger, but was something more like assessment, the way a person looks at a situation they are already working out how to manage. He picked up the second bag before she had to ask. "Long ride," he said. "Long enough," she said, "that I have decided I dislike wheels." He almost smiled. "Welcome to Duskwater." She looked at the crowd still watching from the boardwalk. "Are they all here for me?" "Afraid so." She considered this for a moment. "I hope they enjoyed the show," she said in a voice perfectly level, and she walked toward the wagon. A few people laughed at that too, but differently. Greyson Mull had sent for a wife in the same way he did most things, which was quietly and without much announcement. He had not discussed it with his neighbors. He had not asked the opinion of Sheriff Aldous, or of Burl at the hardware store, or of anyone else in Duskwater. He had simply written a letter to an agency in Boston, described himself and his property honestly, stated what he was looking for, and sent it. The town had found out anyway, because the town always found out. By the time the letter had been confirmed and a reply received, Duskwater had already assembled its opinion. Mrs. Wycliffe had expressed that opinion most completely. She was a woman of 62 who had run the boarding house on the main street for 30 years and considered herself to be the part of the community that kept things properly organized, which in practice meant she felt entitled to comment on all of it. She had found Greyson at the post office 3 weeks earlier and had delivered her verdict without being asked. "I hear she has no money," Mrs. Wycliffe said. "No land, no family to speak of, no skills anyone has been able to name. A woman who has been passed over and is coming west because there is nowhere else for her to go." She folded her hands over her shawl. "You are bringing a burden into your home, Greyson Mull. A burden in a dress." Greyson had been sorting a small stack of envelopes. He did not look up immediately. "Maybe she is a decent person," he said. "That counts with me. Decent does not repair a fence. Some decent people do." Mrs. Wycliffe made a sound that communicated her full position on the matter and left. Greyson had gone back to his envelopes. What he had not told Mrs. Wycliffe, because she had not asked and because it was not her business, was why he had sent the letter in the first place. It was not loneliness, exactly. Loneliness was a word for something that had edges, a defined absence you could point to. What Greyson had was different. His house was not empty. He was in it. He ate in it and slept in it and moved through it every day. But it sounded empty, even when he was there. His wife May had died in February of 1878, 5 years ago now, of typhoid fever. She had been ill for 11 days. Greyson had sat with her every night of those 11 days and had not allowed himself to think about what was coming. And then it had come anyway. He had buried her on the hill east of the ranch, where she had liked to sit in the evenings, because the light was good there. He had not changed the curtains in her room. He had told himself, the first year, that he would get around to it. The second year, he had stopped telling himself anything about it. By the 5th year, the curtains were simply part of the house, the same as the walls, something he moved past without seeing. He had sent the letter in June. By August, a reply had come. The woman's name was Nora Finch. She was 34, from Boston. She wrote in a clear hand, without decoration, and said what she meant without spending many words on it. She said she was looking for honest work and honest company. She said she was not afraid of difficult conditions. She said she had experience with practical tasks and that she believed in pulling her own weight. She had mentioned, almost in passing, in the last paragraph of her second letter, that her father had been a man of science and that she had some familiarity with geological study, though she had not elaborated. Greyson had not known what to make of that detail. He had filed it somewhere in the back of his mind and not thought about it much. A woman who knew something about rocks seemed neither more nor less useful than a woman who did not. What had stayed with him was the quality of her letters. They did not beg. They did not perform. They stated, plainly, what she had and what she wanted, and left the decision to him. He had respected that. It was a quality he recognized, the willingness to say a thing straight and let it stand. He had written back. She had written again. By July, the arrangement had been agreed upon. He had not been certain, standing at the edge of that boardwalk, watching the stagecoach door, that he had done the right thing. He was still not certain. He was 40 years old, and he had a small ranch and a barn with a lean to it, and 2 horses, and a life made mostly of work. And he had sent to Boston for a woman he had never met, and asked her to come share it. He watched her walk toward his wagon. She did not look around for approval. She did not look to see if she was being watched, or if people were still laughing, or if she had made an impression. She walked toward the wagon because that was where she was going, and that was the only thing she was focused on. He picked up her second bag and followed. On the road out of town, with the buildings of Duskwater falling behind them and the open country opening ahead, she sat on the bench beside him and looked at the land without speaking. The Texas landscape in September had a particular quality to it. The grass gone gold and dry, the sky wide and very blue, the distant ridge of stone to the northeast sitting against the horizon like something permanent. After a while she said, "You should know I did not come out here to be rescued." "Good," Greyson said. "I did not send for someone to rescue." She looked at him then, a direct look, taking stock. "Why did you send for a wife?" He thought about that for a moment. The wagon wheel found a rut and climbed out of it. "Because my house sounds empty," he said, "even when I am in it." She was quiet for a moment, a long enough moment that he wondered if the answer had been wrong. "That is honest," she said. "It is easier to remember than lying." She looked back at the road ahead. He did not ask her why she had come. He figured she would tell him when she wanted to, and he figured she probably had her own version of the same answer. Mull Ranch sat 3 miles east of Duskwater, on a flat stretch of land with the creek running along its southern edge and the stone ridge rising to the northeast. It was not a grand property. The house was solid, a single story of board and batten, 4 rooms, with a covered porch along the front. The barn sat 20 yards back, built a little crooked because Greyson had built most of it himself in a summer when he was rushing, and it showed. There was a well, a smokehouse, a fenced yard for the horses. When they arrived, she stepped down from the wagon and took one long, unhurried look at everything. The house, the well, the barn, the lean of the structure, the creek, and then, at length, the ridge to the northeast. "You built most of this yourself?" she asked. "Most of it. Barn leans because I was working alone and moving too fast." "The house is solid," she said. "Does it leak?" "When the storm comes from the north. Then we will fix it." She said it matter-of-factly, without sentiment, the way a person says a thing they have already decided. He glanced at her. "We," he said. "If I am staying, I work." She carried her own bags inside without asking where to put them. She found the kitchen and built up the fire without being told where the wood was. That evening she cooked supper, washed the dishes after, and then came out onto the front porch and stood looking at the northeast ridge in the fading light. Greyson came out and stood beside her. The ridge caught the last of the sun differently than the flat land around it, the stone holding color after the grass had gone gray. She was looking at it with an attention that was not casual, the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand, not simply something they are watching. "See something?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "The shape of the cut," she said, "the way the ridge runs, the color of the exposed stone along the upper face." She paused. "That ridge has signs." "Signs of what?" She looked at him then, the way she had in the wagon, that direct, measuring look. But this time, there was something in it that had not been there before. A kind of careful waiting, as if she were deciding how much to trust the silence she was standing in. "Gold," she said. "Possibly copper. Possibly something more." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the ridge. Then back at her. "How do you know that?" She adjusted her grip on the porch rail. "My father was Edmund Finch. He was a geologist, self-taught, which meant no university would acknowledge him and no mining company would hire him. But he knew stone the way some people know weather, from the inside out. I learned from him, from his books, from his notes, from standing beside him while he worked and listening to every word he said, including the ones he said to himself. She stopped. I also learned from men who did not know I was listening. Greyson said nothing. I know ore veins, she continued. I know the way stone breaks, the way color changes in a seam, what certain staining means, how to read a dry creek bed for what it carried before the water left. If that ridge is what I think it is, there is something valuable in it. Possibly very valuable. The last of the light went off the ridge. The sky above it went from orange to a deep blue-gray. You can tell that from here? Greyson asked. Not with certainty. I would need tools. I would need time. What kind of tools? She turned to look at him. Something in her expression shifted, very slightly, the smallest release of tension, as if she had expected something else from him and was recalibrating. Chisels, she said, rock hammers, pans for washing gravel, a hand lens if we can manage it, rope, buckets, good shovels, nothing that is not practical. Greyson looked at the ridge once more, the dark shape of it against the darkening sky. He had a small ranch and a crooked barn and 2 horses, and a life that sounded empty even when he was in it. He did not know much about stone or veins or what certain colors in rock might mean. But he knew something about the quality of a person who said what they meant and meant what they said. He had recognized it in her letters, and he recognized it now in the way she stood on his porch in the last of the September light and told him a true thing without performing it. All right, he said. She looked at him. I will go into town in the morning, he said, and get what you need. She did not say anything immediately. The silence between them had a different quality than the silence before. Something had settled in it. Most people laugh, she said quietly. I am not most people, he said, and went inside. She stayed on the porch a while longer. Later that night, when the house was dark and the fire in the kitchen had burned down to coals, Nora Finch sat at the small table in her room with a candle and unrolled the leather tube she had carried under her arm all the way from Boston. The leather was old, darkened from years of handling, the seams worn soft at the edges. She treated the opening of it with a care that was not careless and not hurried, the way a person handles something they know the value of. Inside was a map, not a printed map, but a hand-drawn one, ink on heavy paper now yellowed at the edges and creased along the fold lines from years of being opened and closed and opened again. The lines were precise and confident, the handwriting in the margins small and exact. It was a geological survey of a region of North Texas, drafted in 1871. In the upper right corner, in her father's hand, E.W. Finch, Survey, April 1871. And in the center of the map, a region circled in red pencil, faded now but still visible. Above the circle, 2 words and a note. Her father's careful script, Duskwater Ridge. Promising. Need tools. Need time. 12 years ago, Edmund Finch had stood somewhere near this land and seen what she had seen from the porch tonight. 12 years ago, he had drawn this circle and written those words and believed, with the certainty of a man who understood stone, that something was there. And then he had gone back to Boston and tried to find someone who would fund him. And the mining companies had declined because he had no credentials, and the banks had declined because he had no collateral, and the scientific societies had declined because he was not a member of anything they recognized. And he had grown old in a rented room and died in the winter of 1874 with his notebooks stacked beside him and no one to leave them to except his daughter, who had promised him she would not let what he knew disappear with him. She had spent 9 years after his death trying to use what he had taught her. She had applied to survey companies and been turned away. She had offered her knowledge to mining operations and been laughed at. She had written letters to 3 separate geological societies and received, in response, 2 polite rejections and 1 that was not polite at all. She had learned to stop mentioning geology early in a conversation with a man she did not know, because the mention of it changed his face in a way that ended the conversation before it had properly started. She had almost left it out of her letters to Greyson Mull entirely. She had mentioned it in the last paragraph of the second letter, almost in passing, because she had decided she would not begin something built on leaving out the most important part of herself. If it ended the correspondence, better to know that before she packed her bags. It had not ended the correspondence, and tonight, on the porch of his ranch in the fading September light, she had said the truest thing she knew how to say, and he had not laughed. He had asked what tools she needed. She rolled the map carefully and slid it back into the leather tube and set it on the shelf above her bed. Outside, the ridge rose dark against the stars. The same ridge her father had circled in red pencil 12 years ago. The same stone, the same shape, the same promise. She was here now. She had the knowledge. She had the time. Tomorrow, if he kept his word, she would have the tools. She blew out the candle. For the first time in a long time, the dark did not feel like an ending. Greyson left before sunrise. Nora heard the horse before she heard anything else, the soft knock of hooves on dry ground, the creak of the gate. She was already awake, sitting at the small table with her father's map unrolled in the gray light before dawn, tracing the lines she had traced 100 times before with her finger, not reading them so much as remembering them. She had not asked him to go that morning. She had given him the list the night before, written in her careful hand on a page torn from the back of one of her notebooks, and he had folded it and put it in his shirt pocket without comment. She had not known what to expect. Experience had taught her not to expect much. She listened to the horse move out toward the road and sat with that for a moment. Then she got up, built the fire, and started breakfast. Burrell's hardware store was the largest building on Duskwater's Main Street after the saloon and the livery, a fact that said something about the town's priorities that Burrell himself had long since stopped noticing. He was behind his counter when Greyson came through the door at 7:30, still working through his first cup of coffee, and he looked up with the expression of a man who had heard enough gossip in the past 3 weeks to last him a season. Greyson set the list on the counter without preamble. Burrell read it. His eyebrows moved. He read it again. "You planning to fight a mountain?" he said. "I need those things." Burrell looked over the list a second time, slower. Rock hammers, chisels, pans, hand lens. He set the paper down and looked at Greyson with the expression he reserved for conversations he was going to repeat later. "This is for the bride and her treasure stories." "She asked for tools," Greyson said. "I am buying tools." "Greyson." Burrell put his hands flat on the counter. "I like you. I have liked you for 15 years, so I am going to say this plainly because I think you deserve that." He lowered his voice slightly, which in practice meant anyone within 10 feet could still hear him clearly. "That woman has the whole town talking. People are calling her Fool's Fortune Finch. You have known her 2 days. You are about to spend money you do not have a lot of on something that is almost certainly nothing, because a woman with a map told you there was gold in your ridge." He paused. "That is the plain version." Greyson looked at him for a moment. How much for everything on the list? Burl made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a laugh, and began moving around the store. By the time the wagon was loaded, a small audience had assembled on the boardwalk. This was not accidental. In a town the size of Duskwater, a loaded wagon was an event, and a loaded wagon belonging to a man who had recently sent for a mail-order bride, and was now apparently outfitting a mining operation, was something close to a spectacle. "Don't forget a crown," someone called out. "For the mining queen." Another voice from the direction of the saloon. "Maybe she'll dig emeralds out of the chicken yard." A third, which Greyson recognized as belonging to a man named Casper who had bad debts at 3 establishments and strong opinions at all of them. "Careful, Greyson. Next, she'll want a palace." Greyson tied the last of the load down, checked the knot, and climbed up onto the bench. He did not look at the boardwalk. He clicked the horse forward and drove out of town. When he came through the gate of the ranch, Nora was on the porch. She had been watching the road. She did not pretend otherwise. She saw the wagon, and she stood still for a moment, looking at the load in the bed. And then she came down the steps and walked toward it. She climbed up on the wheel to see better. She looked at the rock hammers, the chisels, the pans, the coil of rope, the hand lens wrapped in cloth. "You bought everything," she said. "Most of what I asked for. The lens cost more than I expected. I got what I could manage." She was quiet for a moment. Her hand moved to the handle of the larger rock hammer, and she touched it in the particular way that a person touches something they have needed for a long time and not had. "Why did you do this?" she asked, not demanding, genuinely asking, as if the answer mattered and she wanted to understand it. "Because you said you needed them," he said. She looked at him. Her throat moved. Something in her expression shifted in a way she did not entirely prevent. "No one has ever done that for me," she said. "Get used to it," he said, and climbed down to start unloading. They began on the ridge that afternoon. Nora moved along the stone face with a precision that had nothing uncertain about it. She was not wandering. She was reading. She ran her fingers along seams, broke small samples with the chisel, and examined the fresh breaks in the slant of the afternoon light, crouched over loose material at the base of the outcrop, and sorted through it with a methodical patience that made Greyson think of a person reading a book they have read before, checking that the story is still the same. She marked certain places with strips of torn cloth tied to whatever projection offered itself. Red cloth meant dig here. White cloth meant return and look again. She had a system, and she followed it without explaining it. And Greyson, who had no knowledge of stone and knew it, watched and learned what he could. "Why here?" he asked, at a section of rock that looked to him identical to the section 3 feet to the left. She crouched and tapped the stone with the chisel. "Rust staining along this line. Quartz vein running northeast. Pressure fracture here and here." She touched each place in turn. "And this." She pointed to something he would have walked past without seeing. A faint greenish trace along the edge of a break. Something moved through this rock. Fluid, heat, pressure. When that happens in the right conditions, it leaves things behind. Gold. Possibly. Mining starts with possibly. Good mining turns possibly into proof. He looked at the green trace. "How do you know the conditions were right?" "I do not know yet," she said. "That is what we are finding out." The day settled into a shape. They were up before full light. Breakfast was quick, practical, something that could be eaten without sitting down if necessary. By the time the sun was fully up, they were on the ridge, working along the face in sections, Nora directing and Greyson digging where she pointed. He was stronger than she was, and he did not pretend otherwise, and she knew the stone, and she did not pretend otherwise. And between those two facts, they worked together with an efficiency that required almost no discussion. He learned her signals. A flat hand meant stop. A tipped head to the left meant move 6 inches that direction. A brief closed fist over a crack in the rock meant this one matters. On the third day, she rejected a bright, shining stone without a second glance. "Not what I thought," she said, setting it aside. "It looks valuable," Greyson said. "It looks like it wants to." She turned it once in her fingers and set it down on a flat rock behind her. Wrong formation. Wrong company in the surrounding stone. Wrong light. A thing that wants to look like something is not the same as a thing that is something. He looked at the stone. "You say that like you are insulting it." "I am," she said, and moved on. Sheriff Aldous rode out on the 4th day. He came in the late morning, when the sun was already hot and both of them were dusty and working. He sat his horse at the edge of the ridge and watched them for a while before announcing himself, which was a habit of his that some people found unsettling and others found useful, depending on which side of things they were usually on. "Well," he said at last, "I will be." Greyson rested on his pick handle. "Aldous." The sheriff looked at Nora, who was crouched over a sample and had not looked up. "You really are digging holes for your mail-order bride." "Looks that way." Aldous tilted his head at Nora. "Find anything yet, ma'am?" Nora broke the sample carefully along a line she had scored with the chisel, examined the interior, and set both halves down before answering. "Not yet, Sheriff." She stood and brushed her hands on her skirt. "But I did find a man willing to work harder than most of the men in town, which I consider a promising start." Aldous barked a laugh that came out sharper than he intended. He looked at the strip of cloth markers along the ridge face, the sorted samples on the flat rock, the careful system of it. He pointed at the markers. "You actually know what you're looking at? Do you know how to track a man on foot through open country?" He looked at her. "I do." "How?" "Boot print," he said after a moment. "Broken brush, disturbed ground, the way dust settles different where a weight has been." "Stone leaves marks the same way," she said. "Pressure, heat, fluid movement, they all leave evidence. I read the evidence." She paused. "Whether anyone believes the reading is a separate matter." Aldous was quiet for a moment, looking at her with an expression that was not quite respect yet, but was orienting itself in that direction. "Good luck with your evidence," he said finally, and turned his horse back toward town. After he had gone, Greyson said, "You enjoy that." "Only a little," she said, but the corner of her mouth moved. It was the first time he had seen that. 2 weeks passed. They found traces, small flecks in 2 pans, enough to confirm the presence of something without confirming the presence of enough. The work was slow, and it was dirty, and it was not romantic in any of the ways that stories about gold strikes usually were. It was hard physical labor in the Texas heat with uncertain results, and the constant awareness that the money in the jar on the kitchen shelf was not growing while the time spent on the ridge was. The days on the ridge had a texture that Nora had not expected. She had worked in the field before, in brief and grudging allowances when a survey company needed an extra hand and could be persuaded to overlook what she was, but she had never worked a site that was hers to direct entirely. She had never been the one who decided where the day began and where it ended, which sections to open and which to leave, how to pace the work against the available tools and the available light. She found that she was good at it, not only at the geology, which she had known, at the management of a project that moved through time with real constraints. Greyson was strong and patient and did not require instruction beyond the first time, which was rarer than she had expected. He watched what she did and adapted, and when she changed her method because the stone changed, he changed with her without asking why, which meant she did not lose time, explaining decisions she needed to be making rather than justifying. They developed a rhythm that was particular to the two of them and to this specific work, and she thought sometimes that this was what her father had been missing in all those years of solitary surveys and solitary writing. Not necessarily a partner in the romantic sense, but a partner in the practical sense. Someone whose abilities complemented rather than duplicated your own. Someone who showed up every morning without being asked and did the thing that needed doing while you did the thing only you could do. She thought about this more than she thought was strictly necessary, and she did not examine the thinking too closely. The Texas heat in late September was a different quality of heat than anything she had known in Boston. It was not humid in the way that northeastern heat was humid. The oppressive closeness of it, the way it made the air feel inhabited. This was a drier thing, more absolute. The sun a physical presence on the back of her neck when she crouched over a sample. She had bought a wider hat in the first week, from a woman at the dry goods store who had said nothing about who she was and what the town thought of her, only measured the brim correctly and charged a fair price. Nora had appreciated both things equally. She drank water that tasted of the leather bag it came in and ate bread at noon, sitting on the flat rock above the main section of the ridge. And she looked out over the flat Texas country to the west and thought that this was one of the larger landscapes she had ever worked in, larger than the hills outside Philadelphia, larger than the river valleys in upstate New York, where she had briefly surveyed for a company that had not known she was a woman until she arrived on site. This landscape did not apologize for its size. It simply was what it was, extending in all directions without qualification, and she had found that she liked that quality in a place. One evening, after supper, Greyson sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open and the jar beside it and worked through the numbers quietly. He did not make a production of it. He simply did what needed doing and let the numbers say what they said. Nora was at the stove banking the fire for the night. She watched him without appearing to watch him. "You can stop," she said after a while. He looked up. "All of this," she said, "the ridge, the tools, the time we are spending, you have done more than anyone would have. If you want to call it finished, say so. I will understand. Do you want to stop? No. Then neither do I." He closed the ledger, looked at the fire. "I think the world quits on people too quickly." She was quiet. She set down the iron poker and looked at the table, not at him, as if the words needed somewhere to land that was not a face. "Yes," she said very quietly, "it does." It was the most personal thing she had said to him. He did not press it. He let it sit where she had put it and left it alone. Decker Vane first appeared in Duskwater on a Thursday, in the way that men like Decker Vane tend to appear in small towns, which is to say quietly, without announcement, and already knowing more about the town's business than a stranger reasonably should. He was perhaps 45, heavy through the shoulders, with a face that had been handsome once and had since accumulated the particular look of a man who had made a long series of bad decisions and blamed each of them on someone else. He wore good clothes that had not been well cared for. He bought a drink at the saloon and listened more than he talked. And by the end of the first evening, he had heard everything there was to hear about Greyson Mull and the mail-order bride who claimed there was gold in the Northeast Ridge. The second day, he visited the county land office in Hatcher's Crossing. He told no one what he was looking for. The clerk was young and incurious and pulled the file without asking questions. Decker read through the property records for Mull Ranch with a patience and thoroughness that a man with bad debts and good information sources tends to develop over time. He found what he was looking for in 20 minutes. The survey of 1876, when Greyson had purchased the ranch from the previous owner. The man hired to measure the boundaries had been cheap and in a hurry, and it showed. The northern boundary line was marked at a position 38 feet further south than the description in the original land grant. A small error, an easy error to miss if you were not looking for it. Decker Vane was looking for it. He made notes, folded them carefully, and tucked them inside his coat. That evening in Duskwater, he bought a second drink and began, very gently, to introduce a thought into the conversation. Not a claim, not an accusation, just a thought. The kind of thought that, in a small town, has a way of becoming fact by the third time it is repeated. I heard, he said to no one in particular, that the survey on the Mull property was done by old Hennessy back in '76, and Hennessy was not, toward the end, what you would call thorough. He shrugged. He drank. Probably nothing. He said it twice more in two different conversations before he left the saloon. The thought had been planted. Nora knew none of this yet. On that same Thursday evening, she was on the upper section of the ridge, working a section she had been saving, a narrow terrace of exposed stone that her father's map had marked with particular attention. She worked slowly, carefully, breaking samples and examining each one in the flat evening light. She was about to stop for the night when she noticed something in the stone she had not noticed before. Not in the stone beside the stone. A notch, partially obscured by lichen and the debris of years, cut at an angle that was not natural, not a crack, not a fracture line, a cut, made by something with an edge. She cleared the lichen with her chisel and crouched close. The cut was old. The lichen had taken years to grow back as far as it had. Someone had been here before, had made this mark, and then had not returned, or had not known what to do next. She sat back on her heels. She looked at the cut. She looked at the surrounding stone. She looked at the position on the ridge, and then she looked at the view from where she was sitting, the creek, the flat land, the distant outline of Duskwater. She opened her satchel and took out the leather tube. She unrolled her father's map and held it against her knee, anchoring one edge with her thumb. She found the position on the map that corresponded to where she was sitting and looked at what her father had written beside it. Stop here. Wrong tools. Return. He had stood in this exact place. He had made that cut in the stone, or found it, or followed it. He had looked at what she was looking at and understood something she had not yet understood. And then something had stopped him. He had not returned. He had gone back to Boston with his maps and his notes and his knowledge that no one believed. And he had never come back. She pressed her hand flat against the stone for a moment, against the old notch in the rock, the place where her father's chisel had been. Then she rolled the map carefully and put it away. She did not call for Greyson. She needed to think first, to understand what she was looking at before she said anything. She had learned, over years of being dismissed, The cost of speaking before she was certain. She could not afford to be uncertain here. Not on this ridge, not with this man, not with these tools he had bought on her word alone. She studied the stone for another hour in the fading light. She broke 2 more samples. She examined the color and the grain and the way the pressure fractures ran and the angle of the notch and what all of it said together. By the time the light was truly gone, she had formed a thought that was not yet proof, but was no longer only hope. She climbed down from the ridge in the dark, moving carefully, one hand on the stone face. Greyson was on the porch when she came across the yard. He had a cup of something and was looking at the ridge. He looked at her when she came close enough to see his face. "Find something?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the ridge in the darkness, at the shape of it against the stars. "My father was here," she said, "in 1871. He stood on this ridge and saw what I am seeing, and he marked it, and he left. He ran out of time, or money, or someone turned him away. I do not know which." She paused. But he was right. He was right about everything. Greyson said nothing. He looked at her, and then at the ridge, and then back at her. "Then we finish what he started," he said. She looked at him. In the dark, his face was difficult to read, but his voice had been plain and uncomplicated, the way he said most things, and she believed it. "Yes," she said, "we do." She went inside. He stayed on the porch a while longer, looking at the northeast ridge where it rose dark and patient against the night sky, holding whatever it held, waiting for someone who knew how to ask the right question. Inside, in her room, Nora Finch sat at her small table and wrote in her notebook by candlelight, recording what she had found, what she thought it meant, and what she planned to do next. She wrote in the precise hand her father had taught her, the way he had always said a scientist should write, as if the person reading it after you are gone needs to be able to follow every step without asking you questions. She wrote for an hour. Then she closed the notebook and put it on top of the leather tube on the shelf above her bed. She lay down without undressing, her boots still on, her hands folded on her chest. Tomorrow she would go back to the ridge. Tomorrow she would follow the line from her father's notch and see where it led. She was close. She could feel it in the stone, in the angle of the cuts, in the color of the samples she had taken, in the last of the evening light. She was very close. And somewhere in Duskwater, in a room above the saloon with a glass of whiskey and a folded sheet of notes from the county land office, a man named Decker Vane was also thinking about the ridge, not about what was in it, about the 38 feet of property line that might, if a judge read the original survey generously, shift the boundaries of what belonged to whom. Decker was a patient man when money was involved. He had learned that the best time to move was not when a thing was still uncertain, but when someone else had done the work of making it certain for you. He could wait. The breakthrough came on a Wednesday afternoon in the 4th week, when both of them were tired and the sun was high, and neither of them had spoken in nearly an hour. Nora had been working the narrow terrace above her father's old notch for 3 days, moving along it in sections the width of her shoulders, clearing debris, breaking samples, reading what the stone said, and checking it against what the map said, and then checking both against what she felt in the tips of her fingers when she pressed them into a fresh break. She had learned to trust that feeling. Her father had told her that geology was partly science and partly conversation, that you had to be willing to listen to what the stone was trying to say, even when it was saying it quietly. The stone had been saying something quietly for 3 days. On the Wednesday afternoon, it stopped being quiet. She was working a narrow seam near an old water cut, a place where some ancient flow had forced its way through the rock and left a thin shadow of itself behind. She had been clearing the face with short, careful strokes when her chisel found a give that was not in the surrounding stone. A softness that was not softness exactly, but a difference. A place where the rock had parted along a line that was not random. She stopped. She leaned in close, tilting her head to catch the light at the right angle. There was something in the break. Something that did not belong to the gray of the stone around it. Greyson. He had been digging 6 feet to her left. He heard the particular quality in her voice, the one she used when a thing was real rather than possible, and he dropped the pick and came without asking why. "What do you see?" she said. He looked at the seam where she was pointing. At first he saw only rock, the way he had seen only rock for 3 weeks, and then had begun to see something more than rock, the staining and the breaks and the things she had taught him to notice. And then, in the shadow of the seam, he saw it. A thread of color. Dull, warm, unmistakable. "Tell me," he said. Her voice was very controlled. The kind of controlled that takes effort. "Hit above it. Just above the line. Not hard." He positioned the chisel, struck once, careful. A section of rock broke free. The seam widened. Nora leaned in with the hand lens, pressing it close, adjusting the angle, and when the light caught correctly, she went still in a way that was different from her usual stillness. She scraped the face clean with the edge of the chisel. The color deepened. Neither of them spoke. Then she looked up at him, and her eyes were bright in a way he had not seen before, a brightness that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. "Gold," she said, "a real vein, not a trace, not a fleck." Her voice nearly failed on the last word. "Greyson, this is real." He stared at the seam. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he is afraid will disappear if he blinks. Then he reached out and took her by the waist and lifted her off the ground. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry and was entirely human, the sound of someone who has held a hope for a very long time and has just been told it was not foolish. He set her down and they both stood, looking at the vein in the rock face, grinning like people who had forgotten to be careful, and then they started to laugh properly, both of them, until the sound of it went out across the empty ridge and had nowhere else to go. They worked until the light was gone. They tested the seam in 6 places. They hauled samples down to the shed and examined them by lantern, breaking each one carefully and looking at the interior with the hand lens, comparing color and density and the way the gold sat in the surrounding quartz. It was not a large vein. It was not the kind of discovery that made men rich overnight in the stories. But it was real, and it was consistent, and it ran deeper than the surface, which meant it ran somewhere. That was enough. That night, they did not go inside immediately. They sat on the porch in the September dark without planning to, simply finding themselves there after the lantern was put out, both of them too full of the day to want to be indoors yet. The fire Greyson had built in the yard earlier had burned down to coals. He pulled it back to life with a few pieces of wood from the stack by the barn, and they sat near it, not close together, but near enough that the firelight reached both of them. For a while, neither of them said anything. It was Greyson who spoke first. He spoke the way he usually spoke, without preamble, saying the thing directly. May died in February of 78, he said. Typhoid. She was sick 11 days. I sat with her every night, and I did not let myself think about what was coming, because I thought if I did not think about it, it would not come. He was quiet for a moment. It came anyway. Nora did not say anything. She did not offer the usual words. She understood, in the way that people understand who have lost someone themselves, that the usual words were not what was wanted. What was wanted was simply to say the thing and have someone hear it without flinching. I buried her on the East Hill, he said. She used to sit up there in the evenings because she said the light was better than anywhere else on the property. He looked at the coals. I have not changed the curtains in her room. I told myself the first year I would get to it. After that, I stopped telling myself anything about it. Nora watched the fire. Why are you telling me this? She asked, not unkindly, genuinely asking. He thought about it. Because you found gold in my ridge today, he said, and I wanted you to know that this ranch is not only a ranch to me, that it has more in it than stone and grass. He paused. And because I think you have been honest with me, and you deserve the same in return. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, My father's name was Edmund Finch. He was the most intelligent man I have ever known, and he died in a rented room in the winter of 1874 with $2 to his name and a stack of notebooks that no one wanted. She stopped, looked at the fire. He spent 30 years knowing things that other men would not believe because he did not have the right papers, the right name, the right face, in the right room. He was right about stone. He was right about this ridge. And he went to his grave without a single person of consequence ever saying so. Greyson looked at her. He taught me everything he knew, she said, and I promised him I would not let what he understood disappear with him. That is why I am here. That is why I have the map. That is why I will not stop until every foot of that ridge has been read properly. She paused, not only for the gold. The fire shifted. A log settled and sent a small shower of sparks upward that died before they reached the dark. Then today, Greyson said, he was right. She looked at him. Edmund Finch was right, he said, about the ridge. Today proved it. She did not answer immediately. She looked back at the fire and was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer at all. Then she said, very quietly, he would have liked standing on that ridge this afternoon. He would have been insufferable about it, Greyson said. Something happened to her face, a crack in it, something that had been held in place for a long time, releasing all at once, and she laughed. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind that comes from a place deeper than manners. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment, and her eyes were bright again, but differently from this afternoon. Yes, she said. He absolutely would have been. They sat with that for a while. The fire settled into a steady burn, low and orange, and the night air beyond its warmth smelled of dry grass and the mineral sharpness that came off the ridge when the temperature dropped. Neither of them moved to go inside. It was the first time since she had arrived that Nora felt no urgency about anything, no calculation of what the next day required, no inventory of what remained undone, no quiet assessment of whether she was earning the ground she stood on. The gold was real. The ridge was telling her what it knew. The man beside her had asked what tools she needed, and then gone and bought them. She looked at the coals. Her father had sat beside fires like this in the field, in the years when he had taken her along on his surveys, before she was old enough to understand what she was looking at and young enough to think the whole enterprise was adventure. He had always talked at fires, not at her exactly, more the way a man thinks aloud when he is not alone, but is not performing either. She had absorbed more geology beside campfires than from any of his books, because at the fire he spoke without editing himself. She wondered if that was what Greyson had just done. He had not spoken about May to anyone in this town in this way, she suspected. He had said the things a person says publicly about grief, the dates and the facts and the general shape of a loss. But what he had said tonight was the interior version, the one that did not get said often. She understood why he had said it tonight of all nights. Today something had been found that had been buried a long time. It made the other buried things easier to reach. "My mother died when I was 11, she said. She had not planned to say it. She said it to the fire rather than to him. She had been the one who believed my father completely. She used to argue with the men who dismissed him, and she was better at it than he was, because he took dismissal personally, and she did not." She paused. After she was gone, he stopped arguing. He just wrote everything down, as if he was building a case that would be heard eventually, even if not by anyone alive at the time. Greyson did not speak. "I think he was writing it for me," she said, even when he did not know that was what he was doing. The fire moved, a small sound, the settling of wood. "I think you are right," Greyson said. She did not ask what he meant. She understood. She looked at the ridge in the dark and thought of her father standing on that upper terrace in the spring of 1871, 12 years before she was standing on it herself, making the same cut in the same stone with a chisel not so different from the one she carried. And she thought that continuity was perhaps what was left when everything else had been taken. Not justice, not recognition within a lifetime that could use it. Continuity, the work going forward. Someone to carry it. She thought, "I am here. I carried it. Thank you," she said, "for today." "You did the work," he said. "You let me." He was quiet for a moment. "That should not be worth thanking someone for." "No," she said, "it should not. But it is, all the same." They sat until the fire went to coals, and the coals went to gray, and the stars above the ridge were very bright, and the night was entirely quiet. The news reached town in 48 hours. Greyson had not told anyone. Nora had not told anyone. But Hatch, who had been working the lower section of the ridge that afternoon, and had seen them come down from the terrace with a different quality about them, had said something to his wife, and his wife had said something to the woman at the next pew at Sunday service, and by Monday morning, Duskwater had assembled its revised opinion of the situation at Mull Ranch. Burrell appeared at the gate on Tuesday, claiming he needed to verify a nail order that had come in from the previous month. He spent 12 minutes in the yard and left without discussing nails. By Wednesday, Mrs. Wycliffe had baked a pie. She arrived at the door of the ranch house in the mid-morning with the pie held in both hands and an expression that had made significant adjustments since the last time Nora had seen her face. "I always thought, Mrs. Wycliffe said at the door, that you had a look of intelligence about you." Greyson was behind Nora. He said nothing. Nora could feel him not saying it. "Thank you for the pie, Mrs. Wycliffe," Nora said. She took the pie and closed the door. Inside, she set it on the kitchen table and stood looking at it for a moment. "She called you a burden in a dress 3 weeks ago," Greyson said. "I know. Pie does not cover that." "No," Nora agreed. "It does not." She looked at the pie. "But I will eat it anyway, because I did not make pie this week, and waste is a sin." He looked at her. "That is very practical of you." "I am a very practical person." He almost smiled. She had learned to recognize the small signals of it, the way the corner of his mouth moved and his eyes changed slightly. A response he had not fully decided to make yet. She had begun cataloging small things without meaning to. The way he talked to his horses in the morning in a voice he never used with people, low and unhurried and kind. The way he rebuilt the fire at night after she had banked it, not because she had done it wrong, but because he came back from checking the stock late and the house was cold, and he did not want her to wake to a cold kitchen. The way he always picked up the heavier thing without discussion or ceremony, not performing strength, simply doing what was practical, the same way she simply did what was practical, and neither of them found it necessary to remark on it. She had been careful with these observations. She was a woman who had learned the cost of wanting things that were not offered, and she had not yet decided what any of it meant. She kept the observations and reserved her conclusions. That was the most honest thing she could do with them for now. There were other things she noticed that she did not catalog, because they were too particular, too specific to the way this life had begun to feel different from the life she had lived before it. The way a meal tasted different when someone else had laid the fire and heated the kitchen before she came down in the morning. The way the workroom he had built for her at the back of the house, with its wide window facing the ridge and its shelf long enough to hold everything she owned, had changed the quality of her thinking in a way she could not entirely explain. A woman who has always worked in corners and borrowed spaces does not immediately understand what it means to have a room that was built to hold her specific work. It takes time. It comes in quiet increments. She had woken on a Wednesday in the middle of October and lain in the dark and understood for the first time that she was not afraid of what the next day held. Not the work, not the weather, not the question of whether she would still be welcome where she was. That particular fear, the low constant fear of a woman who has always been provisional in every arrangement she had ever been part of, had gone quiet. She did not tell Greyson this. She was not sure she had the words for it that would not sound like more than she meant, but she thought about it when she was on the ridge, her hands in the stone, and the afternoon light moved across the Texas country in that particular way it had in October, everything gold and long and unhurried, and she thought, this is a place I live, not a place I am staying, a place I live. That was its own kind of discovery. On a Friday morning, 10 days after finding the vein, Nora went alone to the upper slope of the ridge to the section she had been saving. She worked for 3 hours in the morning cool before the sun got high. She broke samples, sorted them, set aside the ones that warranted a second look. And then, in the shadow of an overhang she had been working toward for 2 days, she found the stone she had been half afraid to find and half afraid not to. It was embedded in the host rock of the overhang, a cluster of crystals, rough-edged and irregular, their color a deep, saturated green that had nothing modest about it. She cleared the surrounding rock carefully, exposing more of the cluster, and crouched close with the hand lens. Her hands were steady. She made them be steady. The crystals were beryl. The color and the form were unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Whether they were the quality that made beryl into emerald required a better eye than the ridge could offer her. She needed controlled light and the right instruments, and someone whose opinion would hold up in a room full of men who wanted to argue. She took the best 3 pieces and wrapped them in her flannel work cloth, folding the ends over twice, tucking the bundle carefully into the inside pocket of her coat. Then she sat back on her heels and looked at what remained in the rock face. There was more. She could see it, a vein of it running back into the stone, following the same pressure fracture that had guided the gold vein lower on the ridge. The same event, the same ancient heat and movement that had deposited one had deposited the other. Her father had understood this. She could see it in his notes, the way he had marked this section differently from the others, with a double line instead of a single one, and the word careful written twice in the margin. She did not tell Greyson what she had found. Not yet. Not until she was certain. Greyson Mull had trusted her before she had given him anything to trust. He had bought the tools and done the digging and sat beside her at the fire and told her about May, and listened without the expression that men usually got. She would not give him hope she could not yet guarantee. She would not put something uncertain in front of a man who had offered her something certain. She needed to be sure first. She arranged the trip to Hatcher's Crossing on a Saturday. Greyson asked no questions. He saddled the better horse and had it ready at the gate before she was. The jeweler in Hatcher's Crossing was a small man with wire spectacles and the manner of someone who had long since decided that most of what people brought him was not worth his time. A manner which served as effective armor against the endless stream of hopeful prospectors who appeared at his counter with rocks that were not what they thought they were. He took the bundle from Nora, unwrapped it on his workboard, and picked up the first piece with his forceps. He was quiet for a long time. He moved to the second piece, then the third. He replaced his standard lens with a stronger one. He held the third piece up to the window light, then brought it back to the bench lamp, then set it down and sat back in his chair and looked at Nora with an expression that had lost most of its professional boredom. "Where did you get these?" he asked. "From our claim, northeast of Duskwater." He picked up the third piece again, turned it, set it down. "There are 2 poor quality stones here, and one that is not poor quality at all." He named a price for the lot. Then he paused, still looking at the third stone. "The third piece alone, if the vein yields more of this quality." He named a second number. Nora sat very still. On the ride back to Duskwater, she held the horse to a walk longer than was necessary, not because she was tired, but because she needed the time to think before she arrived. The numbers were real. They were not a fortune, not the kind of discovery that built cities, but they were enough. Enough to secure the claim properly, to hire good equipment, to work the ridge in a way that would not destroy what was there trying to get to it quickly. Enough to repair the barn properly and fix the roof and replace the curtains in May's room and still have something left over for whatever came next. Enough to change the shape of a life. When she came through the gate, Greyson was working on the fence at the south corner, replacing a post that had gone soft. He looked up when he heard the horse. She dismounted, tied the horse, and walked toward him. He looked at her face and set down his tools. She stopped a few feet from him and took the cloth bundle from her coat pocket and held it out. He took it, unwrapped it, looked at the 3 rough stones in his hand with the expression of a man who does not know what he is looking at, but understands something is being asked of him. "What are these?" he said. She told him. She told him everything. The overhang, the crystals, the jeweler, the numbers. She told him slowly and plainly, the way she told him everything, without decoration, letting the facts carry the weight. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. He looked at the stones in his palm. He closed his fingers over them, not tightly, just enough to feel their weight. "Gold and emeralds," he said. "Possibly. The quality needs more assessment, but the first indication is strong." He looked at her. Something was happening behind his face that he was not entirely preventing. "Nora, we need to move carefully," she said. "Secure the claim documentation first. Better equipment before we go deeper into the upper vein. Accurate records of everything we extract." She was already moving, already planning. "We should hire outside labor, people we can verify, not opportunists from town who will talk." "Nora," he said again. She stopped. He was looking at her in a way he had not looked at her before. Direct and open and without the careful reserve he usually carried. The wall that was not unfriendly, but was always present. "Thank you," he said. Just that. Nothing elaborate. She looked at him for a moment. The October sun was behind him, and the light caught the dust on his coat, and the gray at his temples, and the lines of his face that were the lines of a man who had worked hard for a long time and had not complained about it. "Your father found this first," he said. "This belongs to him as much as anyone." She looked down at the stones in his hand. "He would say it belongs to whoever does the work," she said. "Then it belongs to you." She looked up at him. "To us," she said. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he looked down at the stones again, and something that was nearly the real smile came, fuller than usual. "We should go in," he said. "You should write it all down before you forget any of it." "I never forget any of it." "Write it down anyway." He turned toward the house, the stones still in his hand. "Your father would have wanted records." She followed him inside, and the afternoon light came through the kitchen window at a low angle and lay across the table in a stripe of gold. And she took out her notebook and uncapped her pen, and the house did not sound empty. When she came through the gate, Greyson was working on the fence at the south corner. He looked up. She dismounted and walked toward him. He looked at her face and set down his tools. Then Sheriff Aldous appeared at the far end of the road, his horse moving at a pace that meant business. Aldous came through the gate calmly. He was carrying a folded paper in his hand, and he held it out to Greyson without ceremony. "I am sorry to bring this," Aldous said. "You should read it tonight." Greyson read it. His face did not change, but he was very still for a moment, and then he folded the paper again along its creases. "Decker Vane," he said. "Filed this morning at the land office," Aldous said. "Dispute over the northern boundary, 38 feet. Nora looked at the folded paper in Greyson's hand. She did not ask to read it. She already knew what it meant. Aldous nodded once to each of them and turned his horse toward town. The formal order arrived the following Monday morning. All extractive activity on the disputed section was to cease immediately. Decker Vane had filed a claim with the Hatchers Crossing County Land Office, asserting that the northern boundary of Mull Ranch had been incorrectly surveyed in 1876, and that the correct boundary placed 38 feet of the ranch's northern section outside of Greyson Mull's legal ownership. Pending resolution of the dispute by the county land commissioner, Tools and materials located within the disputed boundary were to be secured and not removed. The disputed section covered the primary gold vein. Nora read the paper twice. Then she folded it along its original creases. "He has been planning this since before I found the vein," she said. Not a question. "Since before you arrived," Greyson said. She thought about the folded notes she had never seen, the visit to the land office she had not known about, the carefully planted thought about old Hennessy's surveying that had been circulating in Duskwater for weeks. She thought about the way Decker Vane had appeared in town the week after she arrived and had asked questions without appearing to ask questions. She had been working. She had not been watching. "I should have seen it," she said. "You were doing what you came here to do," Greyson said. So was he. Hatch came around the corner of the barn and read the situation in the way that a man who has worked for someone a long time learns to read a yard and the people standing in it. He stopped walking. "Boss?" "We are stopping work on the ridge today," Greyson said. "Until further notice." Hatch looked at the paper in Nora's hand. He nodded once and went back around the corner without asking questions, which was one of the things that made Hatch valuable. The tools on the upper section had to be left where they were. The samples Nora had already brought down were in the shed, technically below the disputed boundary, but she moved them to the back of the house anyway, behind the locked door of the room Greyson had built for her notebooks and maps, because she did not trust the situation to stay technical. She worked through the afternoon mechanically, organizing what she had, recording everything in the notebooks, drawing the vein maps from memory with the precision her father had taught her. She worked because working was the only thing that kept the anger from becoming something she could not use. The anger was real. She had felt it before. The particular quality of anger that comes not from a single injustice, but from a pattern. The accumulation of all the times she had worked twice as hard to be believed half as much. All the doors that had been closed in her face, not because she was wrong, but because she was inconvenient. This was the same thing in a different form. A man who had contributed nothing to the discovery of what was in that ridge was attempting to take the most valuable part of it by exploiting a clerical error from 7 years ago. She was angry. She let herself be angry until supper, and then she put the anger somewhere she could find it later and made herself eat and think. The town responded the way small towns respond to reversals of fortune, which is with the speed and flexibility of people who never fully committed to the previous position anyway. The men who had been clapping Greyson on the back at Burrell's store stopped coming around. Mrs. Wycliffe did not appear with anything baked. Burrell himself was suddenly very busy whenever Greyson came through the door, a busyness that did not extend to being unhelpful exactly, but did not extend to being warm either. People were waiting. They were watching to see which way the wind settled before they decided where they were standing. Nora noticed this. She noted it the way she noted everything, carefully and without expressing more than she felt. She had not expected loyalty from a town that had called her useless 3 weeks ago. She had not built anything on the expectation of it, but she found that observing it clearly, watching the faces turn careful and non-committal, produced in her a cold and clarifying disgust that was somehow more useful than the hot anger had been. On the third evening after the order, Greyson sat at the kitchen table after supper and did not speak for a long time. He had a cup of coffee in front of him that he was not drinking. He was looking at the surface of the table the way a man looks at something that is not there. Nora was at the window, looking at the dark shape of the ridge against the evening sky. "You should go," he said. She turned. He was not looking at her. He was still looking at the table. His voice had been quiet and flat, and had cost him something. Greyson, I mean it. He put his hands flat on the table. I brought you into this. You came out here with a leather tube and 12 years of your father's work, and you found what he knew was here. And now a man with a bad debt and a land office visit is standing between you and what you earned. He stopped. I cannot fix the survey error in a week. I cannot guarantee what the commissioner will decide. I cannot promise you that this does not get worse before it gets better. He finally looked at her. You deserve better than standing in someone else's mess, waiting for someone else's judgment. She looked at him for a long moment. You are trying to protect me, she said. I am trying to be honest. Those are not the same thing right now. She came away from the window and stood across the table from him. Greyson Mull, I am 34 years old. I spent 9 years being turned out of rooms by men who thought my father's work was worth nothing because he taught it to a woman. I came to this ranch with everything I own in one bag and one leather tube, and the knowledge that this ridge was what my father said it was. She put her hands on the back of the chair but did not sit. I found the gold. I found the emeralds. I did that with tools you bought on my word before I had given you a single reason to believe me. She paused. And now you want to send me away because it got difficult. He was quiet. No, she said. I am not going anywhere. He looked at her. Behind his face, the wall was lower than she had ever seen it. Something that was not the controlled reserve she had come to know. Something older and rawer. A man who had been holding things in place for a long time and was very tired. What if I lose the claim? He said. His voice was lower now. What if the commissioner sides with Vane and I cannot fix the paperwork in time, and we lose the primary vein? You will have spent 3 months of your life on something that ends with nothing. Then I will have spent 3 months working on something real, she said, which is more than I had before I came here. She pulled out the chair and sat down across from him. I told you when I arrived that I did not come here to be rescued. That is still true. But it also means you do not get to decide when I leave. He held her gaze. I am not good at this, he said. At what? At letting someone else carry part of it. She looked at him. She thought about the curtains in May's room that had not been changed in 5 years. She thought about the letters he had written to Boston, quiet and honest and without performance, saying exactly what he had and asking for exactly what he needed. She thought about the way he had lifted her off the ground when she found the gold. Unself-conscious and immediate, a man surprised out of his own careful management of himself. I know, she said. You are learning. That night, after Greyson had gone to bed, Nora lit the lamp in her workroom and spread everything she had across the table. The maps, the notebooks, the vein diagrams she had drawn from memory, the survey document Greyson had received, her father's original map with its double-marked section and its careful annotations. All of it. She worked through it methodically, the way her father had taught her to work through a problem, starting with what was known and moving outward from there into what was uncertain and then into what was possible. What was known. The disputed 38 feet covered the section of ridge where the primary gold vein ran. Decker Vane had filed on that basis, and the county order had accepted his framing. What was uncertain, whether the commissioner would uphold the dispute, whether the original survey error was correctable, and how long that correction would take. What she had not yet asked: what exactly was in those 38 feet? She pulled her vein diagrams forward. She had mapped the gold vein in detail over 3 weeks of careful work. She knew where it ran, where it widened, where it narrowed, where it went deeper. She knew its character. She traced the line of it with her finger across the diagram, and she stopped. She sat very still for a moment. Then she pulled her father's map forward and held the 2 documents side by side, comparing the position of the vein against the position of the disputed boundary. The disputed section, the 38 feet Decker vein was claiming, sat at the northern edge of the vein. It covered the section where the vein was at its shallowest and its narrowest, where it ran close to the surface before dipping deeper into the ridge. The section that was easiest to see. The section that was most obvious to anyone looking at the stone face from the outside. She sat back. She pulled her most recent sample records forward and went through them section by section, marking the gold content of each against its position relative to the boundary line. The numbers were clear. The disputed 38 feet contained perhaps 15% of the vein's accessible gold. The remaining 85% and the entire upper section where the barrel vein ran sat well within the undisputed boundary of Mull Ranch. Decker Vein had looked at the surface of the ridge and seen the most visible part of the vein and concluded he was claiming the valuable part. He had no geological knowledge. He had a property dispute and a surveying error and an assumption. The assumption was wrong. She sat with this for a long time, checking her own reasoning, following the numbers back through the diagrams, making sure she had not made an error she wanted to find instead of an error that was there. She checked it 3 times. Each time the conclusion was the same. The most valuable part of what they had found was not in the disputed section. Decker Vein was fighting for the least of it. She closed the notebooks one by one and stacked them neatly. Then she took out a clean page and began to write. The next morning she found Greyson at the barn before he had come in for breakfast. He was brushing down the bay horse with the slow, even strokes of a man whose hands needed something to do. She stood at the barn door and told him what she had found. He listened without interrupting. His hands kept moving on the horse's flank, the brush strokes steady and unhurried. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You are certain," he said. "I have checked it 3 times. And the emerald section is entirely clear of the dispute?" "Entirely. The disputed section does not touch it." He set the brush down on the rail. He looked at the horse for a moment, then at the ridge visible through the open barn door at the far end, pale and patient in the morning light. "Then what does Vein actually have?" he said. "A claim on the thinnest and shallowest portion of the lower vein. Enough to be worth something to a man who does not know there is more below it. Nothing close to what he thinks he has." Greyson turned to look at her. "He does not know this. He cannot know it. He has no geological knowledge. He read the surface and the survey, and he made an assumption about what the surface meant." She paused. He was wrong. Something shifted in Greyson's expression. Not triumph. Something quieter than triumph. Relief, and under the relief, a quality she recognized as the particular steadiness of a man who has found the ground under his feet again. "What do you need?" he said. "I need to show this publicly," she said. "Not in a letter to the commissioner, not in a document filed at the land office. I need to show it in front of people who can see it, and cannot say afterward that they did not see it. She met his eyes. I need Decker Vane on that ridge. She found Decker in front of the saloon at mid-morning, which was where men like Decker Vane could generally be found when they were waiting for other people to do the worrying. She stopped in the street. He looked at her with the expression of a man who considers himself to be in a strong position and wants her to know it. Well, he said, what brings the rock lady out this morning? Several people on the boardwalk had turned to watch. She had timed this deliberately. Morning was when Duskwater was awake and moving, and when the maximum number of people could be in the street without it appearing to be an assembly. I want you to come to the ridge, she said. Her voice was level and carried. Tomorrow morning. Bring whoever you like. He raised his eyebrows. What for? Because you have filed a claim on land you say belongs to you, and I want to show you and everyone else in this town exactly what you are claiming. She paused. If your claim is honest, you have nothing to lose by looking at it clearly. He smiled the smile of a man who thinks he is being invited into a situation he already controls. All right, he said, tomorrow morning. She turned and walked back toward the ranch without looking at the boardwalk. They came. Half the town came, which she had expected. They came because Duskwater had been living on this story for 2 months, and the story had arrived at a moment that required witnesses. Mrs. Wycliffe came. Burrell came. Sheriff Aldous came, and stood at the edge of the group with his arms folded, watching everything, which was what Aldous did and why she had wanted him there. Decker Vane came with 2 men she did not know, large men who were there for effect, and who stood behind him in the way that men stand behind other men when the message is meant to be about presence. Nora stood at the base of the ridge with the chalk and the 2 hammers and her notebooks. Greyson stood to her left and slightly behind her, not in front, behind. He understood what this required. She began without ceremony. The disputed section runs along here, she said, drawing the boundary line in chalk on the stone face at ground level. Clean, accurate, referenced against the survey document she had read 3 times. This is what Mr. Vane's claim covers. She pointed to 3 locations along the marked section and described each one clearly, the way she would describe them to a careful reader, with the evidence visible and the reasoning plain. Decker watched with the expression of a man attending something he considers a formality. Anyone can point at rock, he said. Yes, she said. So point. Tell me where to dig. He blinked. You say this is your land, she said. You say there is value in it. Show us where the value is. Point to where we should dig. He waved a hand. It is all the same. The vein runs through the whole section. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Hatch. They opened the 3rd point she had marked, the one that sat squarely in the center of the disputed section. At 8 inches, nothing. At 15, the stone changed. At 22, the first thread of gold appeared, thin, narrow, running at a shallow angle that tapered as it went. The crowd leaned in. This is the vein in the disputed section, Nora said. Note the width, note the depth, note the angle. She let them look. She gave it time. She did not rush. Then she moved up the slope to a point well above the chalk line, well within the undisputed boundary of Mull Ranch. Now here, she said. Hatch opened the 2nd cut. At 10 inches, the stone changed sharply. At 16, the vein appeared, and it was not the thin, shallow thread of the lower section. It was a seam wide and consistent, running deep into the rock at an angle that said it went further than the afternoon would allow them to follow. The crowd was quiet. Nora climbed higher, to the overhang where the beryl crystals sat in their host rock. She had exposed enough of the vein in the past weeks that it was visible without digging. A line of green running back into the stone like something the mountain had been keeping. She said nothing. She let them look at it. Mrs. Wycliffe made a sound. Aldous straightened. Nora came down from the overhang and stood in front of Decker Vein. The section you are claiming, she said, contains approximately 15% of the accessible gold in this ridge. It contains none of the upper vein. It contains none of the emerald deposit. She kept her voice level and factual and without heat. You are not claiming the valuable part of Mull Ranch's ridge. You are claiming the part that looks like the valuable part to someone who does not know how to read stone. Decker's expression had changed. The confidence was still performing itself, but the performance had gone thin. The survey says what it says, he said. The survey has an error, Nora said. Mr. Mull will be correcting that error with the land commissioner. And when that correction is filed, your claim covers nothing but 38 feet of the least productive section of the lower vein. She paused. But I want to make sure everyone here today understands what you actually claimed and why. She looked at him. And what you said to the county land office about the contents of that section when you filed. Aldous unfolded his arms. Decker said nothing. You told the land office, Aldous said from the edge of the crowd, his voice carrying the particular quality of a man who has been listening carefully and has something to contribute, that the disputed section contained, and I am remembering your exact words here, the primary productive section of the mineral deposit on said property. He looked at Decker. You want to look at those two cuts again and tell me whether that matches what you told the commissioner? The two large men behind Decker shifted their weight. Decker opened his mouth. Do not, Aldous said quietly. The crowd was very still. The two large men who had come with Decker looked at each other, then at the crowd, then at the ridge. And then they walked down the hill and kept walking until Duskwater was behind them. Nobody stopped them. Nobody needed to. Nora stepped back. She had said what needed to be said. She had shown what needed to be shown. The rest of it belonged to Aldous and to the law, and to the people standing on that ridge who had seen with their own eyes what was in the stone and what was not. She looked at Greyson. He was watching her. Not the crowd, not Decker, not Aldous. Her. With the expression of a man who has just seen something he will not forget. Something that has rearranged a small but significant part of how he understands the world. She looked away first. Aldous took Decker by the arm and walked him down from the ridge, speaking to him in the low and unhurried voice of a man explaining consequences to someone who has run out of room to avoid them. The crowd broke apart slowly, the way crowds do when the thing they came to see has finished, and they are not quite ready to go back to ordinary life yet. People looked at the chalk line on the stone, and at the two open cuts, and at the green line of the upper vein, and at each other. Nora picked up the hammers and the chalk and her notebooks and walked down from the ridge. Greyson fell into step beside her. They walked back toward the house in the October morning without speaking. The ridge rose behind them, patient and permanent and full of everything it had always been full of, waiting for someone who knew how to ask the right questions. The walk was perhaps 300 yards, from the base of the ridge across the flat, dry grass to the porch steps of Mull Ranch. Nora had walked it dozens of times in the past 2 months, in all kinds of light and weather and states of tiredness. And she knew the particular give of the ground where the creek ran underground before it surfaced near the eastern fence, and she knew the way the wind came off the ridge in the afternoon, carrying the smell of warm stone. And she knew the sound the porch steps made under her boots, the second one always louder than the first. She knew these things the way you know the details of a place that has become yours, not memorized, simply absorbed. Greyson walked beside her at his usual distance, close enough to be present and far enough to give her the space she had learned he always gave, the same instinct that had led him to stand behind her on the ridge rather than beside her, to let the thing be her thing without making a statement about it. She thought that perhaps the quality she valued most in him was not any single gesture but that instinct itself, the understanding, which she suspected was not something he had thought out, but something that was simply in him, that a person doing their own work needs room to do it in. That presence and interference were not the same thing. That you could stand beside someone completely and still leave them their ground. She had never had that before. She had not known, until she had it, that it was something you could have. At the porch steps, Greyson stopped. She stopped beside him. "You knew," he said. "Last night you knew exactly what you were going to do this morning." "Yes." "You could have told me." She looked at him. "I needed you to sleep," she said. "One of us had to." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face that he did not prevent this time. "Nora," he said. She waited. But he did not say whatever he had been about to say. He shook his head slightly, the smallest movement, and looked at the ridge, and then at the ground. And then he went inside. She stood on the porch a moment longer. The morning was bright and cold, and the ridge was gold and gray in the October sun. And somewhere in Duskwater Aldous was explaining to Decker Vane the difference between a civil dispute and a fraudulent filing. And the claim was not safe yet, but it was safer than it had been at dawn. She stood on the porch and let the morning be what it was. She thought about what had just happened on the ridge, and she thought about it the way she thought about everything, which was methodically and without flattering herself. She had done the work. She had read the stone and drawn the maps and done the arithmetic. And then she had stood in front of a man who thought his assumption was a fact, and she had demonstrated the difference. That was all. It was not courage in the dramatic sense. It was simply the application of knowledge to a problem, which was the only thing she had ever known how to do, and the only thing she had ever been refused the right to do. She thought about all the rooms she had been turned out of, the survey offices, the mining companies, the Geological Society in Boston with its wood-paneled walls and its excellent certainty about what kind of person belonged there. She had carried her father's knowledge into all of those rooms and been returned to the street with it, and she had not stopped. She had not become bitter in the consuming way, the way that closes a person down and makes them useful only for their grievance. She had stayed useful. She had kept the knowledge current and kept herself ready for the moment the door opened that could not be closed again. This had been that moment, not because the world had finally recognized her, because she had found one person who had asked the right question. What tools do you need? She thought that was perhaps enough to change everything. One person, the right question. The rest was work. She went inside. The house did not sound empty. The county land commissioner's ruling came on a Thursday, 12 days after the confrontation on the ridge. Greyson read the letter at the kitchen table while Nora stood at the window with her coffee going cold in her hand. He read it through once, then again, then set it down flat on the table and looked at it for a moment without speaking. "The survey error is confirmed," he said. "The correction is accepted. The original boundary holds." He paused. "Vane's claim is dismissed." Nora did not move for a moment. Then she set her coffee down carefully on the windowsill and sat in the chair across from him and put her hands flat on the table. And they both looked at the letter in the way that people look at something they worked very hard for and are not quite ready to believe has actually arrived. Outside, through the window, the ridge sat in the thin November light, the same as it had always sat, patient and permanent. "Decker Vane," Greyson said. "Has left town," Nora said. "Aldous told me yesterday he packed his things Monday night." Greyson nodded slowly. He folded the letter along its creases and held it for a moment, then set it on top of the stack of notebooks on the side of the table that had become, over the past 2 months, Nora's side of the table. He went out to find Hatch. She heard him cross the yard, heard the low exchange of voices near the barn, heard Hatch make a sound that was not quite a word but communicated everything. Then she heard the sound of the shed being unlocked, the creak of the door, the particular sound of tools being moved. She sat at the table a while longer. Then she went to get her coat. The work resumed that same morning. There was no ceremony to it. Hatch had the tools out and was already on the lower section before Nora had her boots laced. And when she came up the slope, he moved to make room for her without being asked, the way they had all learned to work together over the weeks. A small economy of motion that had developed without anyone designing it. She went straight to the upper section. The overhang was exactly as she had left it. The exposed barrel vein running back into the stone. The green of it dark and steady in the morning light. She had not been back since the day she had stood here and taken the 3 samples wrapped in flannel and carried them down the slope and decided to say nothing until she was certain. She was certain now. She worked through the morning with a precision and a quiet that were not the quiet of suppression but of completion, the feeling of doing something that is exactly what you are supposed to be doing in exactly the place you are supposed to be doing it. At noon, Greyson brought water and bread up from the house, and they sat on the flat rock at the edge of the terrace and ate without talking much, looking out over the flat country to the west where Duskwater sat small and ordinary in the midday sun. She thought about her father sitting somewhere, on a bench in Philadelphia perhaps, or at a desk in the rented room on Callow Hill Street, with his notebook stacked beside him and his knowledge that nobody wanted, looking at a distance she could only imagine. She thought about what it would have meant to him to see this. She did not say any of this aloud. In the first week of November, Greyson drove to Hatcher's Crossing and filed the corrected survey with the Land Commissioner's office, and on the return trip stopped at the County Records Building and spent 2 hours with the clerk going through files that were older than either of them. He told her about it that evening at supper. "I found something," he said. He reached into his coat and put a folded document on the table between them. She looked at it without touching it. "County Records," he said. "April of 1871. She unfolded it. It was a meeting record from the Hatcher's Crossing County Commissioner's office. 3 paragraphs, formal language, dated the 14th of April, 1871. A summary of a request submitted by one Edmund W. Finch of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, proposing a geological survey of mineral deposits in the northeast section of Duskwater County to be conducted at his own expense, results to be shared with the county for public benefit. The request had been declined. The reason given, in the careful handwriting of the clerk who had transcribed it: the applicant does not hold credentials from a recognized institution of geological study and therefore cannot be certified as competent to conduct a formal survey under county standards. Nora read it once, then she read it again. She sat with it. The fire in the kitchen stove made its small sounds. Outside, the wind had come up, the first real cold wind of November, and it moved around the corners of the house in the way that wind does when a house is built solid enough to resist it. Greyson said nothing. He had understood, when he found this document, that it was not his to manage. He had brought it to her, and now he waited. She read the document twice. Then she set it down and sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of the kitchen for a long moment, which was something Greyson had never seen her do. She was a woman who looked at things directly. She did not look at ceilings. When she looked back down, her eyes were dry, but something in her face had shifted in a way that was different from grief and different from anger, and was perhaps what a person looks like when they have been carrying a weight for so long that being told it was real, that it was always real, is almost too much to hold at once. "He came here," she said. "He stood on that ridge. He knew." She looked at the document. "And they sent him a letter." "Yes," Greyson said. "He died in a rented room thinking no one would ever know he was right." Greyson was quiet. "Now they will," she said. She folded the document carefully and held it a moment before putting it away. "Now they will know." She pressed her hand flat on the paper, over her father's name, E.W. Finch. The same careful letters. The same man who had stood on the upper terrace of this ridge in the spring of 1871 and cut a notch in the stone and written 2 words in the margin of his map: "Stop here. Return." He had not returned. This document was part of why. She took her hand off the paper and folded it along its creases. "He was right about everything," she said. "And they sent him a letter." "Yes," Greyson said. "And now we have the gold and the emeralds and the corrected survey and his name in the county record." She looked at the folded document. "I am going to keep this." "I know," he said. "That is why I brought it." She looked at him across the table. He was looking back at her with the steady, open quality he had developed over the past 2 months. The wall that had been present when she arrived worn down now to something that was simply his face. A face she had come to know in the way you come to know a place you have lived long enough to stop noticing its edges. She put the document inside the front cover of her primary notebook, where she kept things that needed to stay. The supper in the barn happened on the last Saturday of November. It had been Greyson's suggestion, which surprised her, because organizing gatherings was not a quality she had associated with him. He said simply that he thought it was time, and that the barn was the only space large enough, and that Hatch's wife made a stew that was better than anything either of them could manage. Nora had looked at him for a moment. "You want to invite the people who spent 2 months laughing at us and then ran when the claim was disputed." "Some of them," he said. "Not Vane." "Vane has left town." "Then all of them," he said. She had agreed because she understood what he was doing, even if he had not said it, and because she thought her father would have agreed too, for the same reasons she did. Not forgiveness as forgetting. Forgiveness as the decision to live forward instead of backward. The town was where they lived. This was where she lived now. That was a fact she had made her peace with some time ago, and peace required an accounting. They came, Mrs. Wycliffe came first, which was not a surprise because Mrs. Wycliffe had a sense of occasion that overrode most other considerations. She brought her good shawl and the expression of a woman who has decided to say something difficult and has been rehearsing it. Burl came with his wife. Sheriff Aldous came and put his hat on the post inside the door and moved through the crowd with the ease of a man who knew everyone and owed nothing. Hatch's wife brought the stew in 2 large pots, and it was as good as advertised. The barn was warm from the bodies and the lanterns and the stove Greyson had moved in from the shed, and the sound of it was the sound of people who have known each other a long time and are practicing being themselves again after a period of something less than that. Nora moved through it and received what people offered, which varied from the genuine to the approximate, and accepted all of it with the same measured grace because the differences were visible to her and she did not need to perform her awareness of them. Burl found her near the food table and complimented her work on the ridge in the sheepish way of a man who knows he was on the wrong side of something and is trying to account for it without fully admitting the accounting. She thanked him. She meant it well enough. She had learned in the years before Duskwater that the people who convert most quickly are rarely the ones who were most unkind. They are simply the ones who need permission to think differently. Burl had needed evidence. He had the evidence now. That was not nothing. She did not feel triumphant about any of it. Triumph implied that she had been competing with these people, and she had not been. She had been working. There was a difference that mattered to her, even if it was not a difference that mattered to the people offering their belated approvals. What she felt, if she was honest, was tired. The good kind of tired. The tired that comes at the end of something real. When the body has done what it was built to do and knows it. She felt it in her hands particularly, in the calluses that had built up over the weeks of ridge work, and in the particular ache across her shoulders that had become so familiar it felt like a signature. She had earned this tiredness. It belonged to her. She found herself standing near the open barn door for a moment, looking out at the dark yard, at the ridge invisible beyond the darkness, and she thought of her father writing his notes by lamplight in whatever rooms he had inhabited over the years, patient and exact, building the record he believed in even when no one else did. She thought, he would have liked this. Not the party. He had not been much for parties. But the work behind the party, he would have liked knowing the work had been done and done right, that his daughter had stood on his ridge and read his stone and proved what he had known. She thought that was enough, more than enough. It was the thing she had come for, the thing underneath the thing she had written in the letter, and she had it now, solid and documented and undeniable. She went back inside. Mrs. Wycliffe found her near the stove. She was a woman who did things directly when she had decided to do them, and she had clearly decided. She stopped in front of Nora and stood very straight in the way that people stand when they are about to say something that costs them something. "I owe you an apology," she said. The room had not gone quiet, but the people nearest them had. "I called you useless before I knew one thing about you. I said it because everyone else was saying it, and because it was easier than thinking, and because I was wrong about you from the first moment, and I continued to be wrong long after I had reason to know better." She paused. "I was wrong about Greyson, too. He saw something in you before any of us were willing to look." Nora looked at her for a moment. "Thank you, Mrs. Wycliffe," she said. "I am sorry," Mrs. Wycliffe said. not elaborating, letting it stand as what it was. "I know," Nora said. Aldous raised his cup from across the barn in the direction of Greyson, who was standing near the door talking to Hatch. Greyson looked up. Aldous nodded once, the small nod of a man making a statement he does not need to explain. Greyson nodded back. She was thinking about the curtains. She had walked past May's room that morning, and the door had been open, which it was not usually, and she had looked in without meaning to. The curtains were new, a pale blue-gray, the color of early morning, hung straight and clean against the window. She had not said anything. She had walked past and gone to the kitchen and built the fire and made coffee. And when Greyson came in 20 minutes later, she had handed him a cup, and neither of them had spoken about it. But she had thought about it all day. Through the preparations for the supper, and through the supper itself, and through all the small exchanges with neighbors who were finding their way back to something easier, she had kept returning to that pale blue-gray curtain and what it meant. It meant that something had shifted in him that had not been able to shift before. And it had shifted now, in the weeks since she had arrived, in the particular way that things shift not because of a single event, but because of an accumulation. The tools bought without question, the workroom built, the fire rebuilt in the mornings, the stones in his palm and his voice saying, "Your father found this first." The way he had stood behind her on the ridge, not in front, because he understood what that moment required. She did not know exactly what the curtains meant in terms of the larger questions she had not yet asked herself, the ones about the future, and what it held, and what she was allowed to want from it. She was not sure she was ready to ask those questions clearly, but she knew what the curtains meant in the immediate sense, in the sense that mattered right now, in the November night with the cold coming under the barn door and the sound of Duskwater trying to be decent around her. They meant that he was still here, and so was she, and the house was not what it had been when she arrived. After the guests had gone, and the lanterns had been turned down, and the last of the cold air had come through, when the door closed behind Hatch and his wife, Nora and Greyson stood in the yard in the November night. The sky was very clear. The kind of clear that comes after cold has settled in properly. Every star sharp and separate, the ridge to the northeast black against the dark blue of the sky, familiar now in the way that only things you have worked beside become familiar. "Greyson," she said. He was standing beside her, looking at the ridge. "I almost did not mention the geology," she said. "In the letters. I nearly left it out entirely. I had left it out of every other conversation for 9 years, because of what happened to my father and because of what happened to me every time I mentioned it." She paused. "I put it in the last paragraph of the second letter, because I decided I would not begin something real by leaving out the most important part of myself." He was quiet. "If you had laughed," she said, "I would not have come." He looked at her then. "I almost did not send the letter at all," he said. "I wrote it twice. The first version I did not send because I thought a woman with any other option would not choose a 40-year-old man with a crooked barn and a ranch that sounds empty." She looked at him. "You told me that before." "I know." He looked back at the ridge. "I am telling you again because I want you to understand that I was wrong about that. About what a woman with options would choose." He paused. The cold moved between them, and neither of them moved away from it. "You had the map and the knowledge and 12 years of your father's work, and you could have gone anywhere. You came here." "I came here because of the ridge," she said. "I know that." "And I stayed because of you," she said. He looked at her. She met his eyes and did not look away. He reached out and took her hand, not tentatively, the way he did everything, with the quiet certainty of a man who has decided and does not need to announce the decision. His hand was warm and rough with work and entirely itself, and she let him keep it. They stood like that in the November night, looking at the ridge, the ranch behind them solid and lit and smelling of wood smoke and the evening's cooking, the house that had been empty now full of all the sounds that a house makes when it is lived in properly. Later, she went to her workroom and sat at her table with the lamp turned low and opened the primary notebook to the front cover. She took out the folded county document, Edmund W. Finch's declined request, and smoothed it flat on the table beside the notebook. She looked at her father's name for a long moment. Edmund W. Finch. The same hand that had drawn the map. The same hand that had written, "Stop here. Return." The same hand that had filled 30 years of notebooks with the precise and careful record of a man who believed that truth was worth documenting even when no one was listening. She had carried his leather tube and his map and his knowledge across a country and up a ridge and into the stone itself. She had done what he had not had the tools or the time or the good fortune to do, and she had done it with the knowledge he had given her, which meant that in the only sense that mattered, he had done it too. She thought about what it would have meant to him to know this. Not the gold, not the emeralds, not the corrected survey or the county record with his name in it. Those things would have mattered, but what would have mattered most was simpler. That someone had stood on his ridge and read his stone and proved that the thing he knew was real had been real all along. She thought he would have sat very quietly with that for a while, the way he had always sat quietly with things that mattered most, not performing his feelings, but letting them settle into him slowly, the way water settles into dry ground. Then she thought he would have wanted to see the notebooks, all of them, every sample, every measurement, every diagram. He would have had questions. He always had questions. She almost smiled thinking about it. She looked around the room he had never seen, the wide shelf long enough to hold her books, the window that faced the ridge, the table broad enough to spread the maps, the lamp that burned clean oil without smoking, a room built for her specific work by a man who had listened when she described what she needed, and then built it without commentary or condition. She thought that her father would have liked Greyson Mull, not in the way that people like someone who flatters them or agrees with them, in the more lasting way, the way that a man recognizes another man who does what he says he will do and does not require applause for it. Her father had been that kind of man, and he had lived most of his life without meeting many others of the same kind, and she thought he would have recognized Greyson immediately and been relieved by the recognition. She thought, he would have liked knowing I found this. She thought, I will keep finding things. That is what this is. Then she opened to the first page of the notebook, the page she had written on the night she arrived, in the first hour in this house, when everything was still uncertain, and the ridge was only a shape in the darkness outside her window. Duskwater Ridge, September 1883, beginning here. She turned to a fresh page at the back. She wrote the date, November 1883. Then she wrote, he was right. It was here all along. She sat with that for a moment. Then she added, in smaller letters below, we finished what he started. It took 12 years, and 2 people who were not afraid to begin. She capped the pen and closed the notebook and set it on the shelf beside the leather tube, where it fit exactly in the space between the tube and the row of her father's geological references, as if the shelf had been built with this specific arrangement in mind. Perhaps it had been. Outside, the ridge rose dark and permanent against the stars, holding everything it had always held, patient as stone, waiting for someone who knew how to listen. The house was not empty. It had not been empty for some time now. She blew out the lamp,